What if the Titanic didn't sink by accident? What if it was never supposed to survive? Three men stood between one of the most powerful bankers in the world and total control of the American financial system. All three boarded the Titanic. None of them survived. The man who owned the ship canceled his ticket. 24 hours before departure, they found him days later, healthy, relaxed, as if he already knew. 6 ice warnings in one day. The ship didn't slow down. The lifeboat drill canceled that morning. No reason recorded. The rescue ship 11 miles away, radio switched off. Every single failure pointed in the same direction. This wasn't chaos. Chaos doesn't have a beneficiary. 20 months after the sinking, the Federal Reserve was created. Its loudest opponents were at the bottom of the Atlantic. The wreck, rising from darkness. Morgan's private safe, still locked. 3,800 meters below the surface. 1,517 people died that night. But only 3 of them were the target. Titanic. Not an accident. On the night of April 14th, 1912, everything was perfect. The sea was completely calm, the sky was clear, the ship was on schedule. And that's exactly what made it so dangerous. There are disasters that happen because of chaos. And there are disasters that happen because everything goes too smoothly. This is the second kind. The RMS Titanic was 4 days into her maiden voyage. She was the largest moving object ever built by human hands. Over 46,000 tons of steel, cutting through the North Atlantic at nearly 22 knots. First-class passengers were finishing dinner. The grand staircase was lit like a ballroom. Somewhere in the lower decks, third-class families were putting their children to sleep, dreaming of America. Nobody was afraid. That was the problem. 14 years before this night, a writer named Morgan Robertson published a novel. It was called Futility. The story followed a massive ocean liner, the largest ever built, described as unsinkable, traveling the North Atlantic in April. It struck an iceberg and sank. The ship in the novel was called Titan. Robertson wrote it in 1898. At the time, nobody paid much attention. Later, people would go back and count the details: the tonnage, the length, the speed, the number of lifeboats. Not enough for everyone on board. The similarities were not approximate. They were precise. We'll come back to that. At the top of the forward mast, 2 men were standing watch: Frederick Fleet, Reginald Lee. Their job was simple: scan the horizon, report anything unusual. They had one problem. The binoculars were missing. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. In low-light conditions, binoculars can extend detection range by several minutes. Several minutes, at 22 knots, is the difference between a course correction and a collision. The binoculars had been locked in a storage locker since Southampton. The key had been taken by an officer who left the ship before departure. Nobody replaced them. Fleet and Lee were scanning the darkness with their bare eyes. Here's the detail that investigators would return to again and again. That night, the North Atlantic was unusually calm. No wind, no waves. Under normal conditions, an iceberg creates a visible line of white water at its base. The sea breaking against the ice. That white line is detectable even at night. But on a perfectly calm sea, there is no white line. The iceberg appears out of the darkness without warning. The ocean that night was the calmest it had been in years. The Titanic had received ice warnings throughout the day. Not 1, not 2, at least 6 separate messages from other ships in the area, all reporting large ice fields directly ahead on the course the Titanic was sailing. Captain Edward Smith had them. He read them. The ship did not slow down. At the time, this seemed like confident seamanship. Ice warnings were common. The North Atlantic in April always had ice. Experienced captains navigated through it. But there was something else in those messages, something that would only become clear later. One of those warnings came from a ship called the Mesaba. She sent her message at 9:40 p.m. The message described a dense field of ice, not scattered bergs, but a massive stretch of pack ice sitting directly across the Titanic's path. The Titanic's radio operator received it. He set it aside. He was busy sending personal telegrams for first-class passengers. The wealthy travelers of 1912 used the ship's radio the way we use our phones today. Messages to business partners, to family, to friends on shore. The Mesaba warning never reached the bridge. We'll come back to that message. Because of all the warnings that night, that one was the most specific, the most accurate, the most dangerous to ignore. At 11:39 p.m., Frederick Fleet saw something in the darkness. He rang the bell 3 times, the signal for an object ahead, and picked up the phone to the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead." The officer on watch ordered hard to starboard. The engines were reversed. 37 seconds passed. 37 seconds between the sighting and the impact. At 22 knots, the ship traveled over 400 meters in that time. The iceberg struck the starboard side below the waterline. The contact lasted less than 10 seconds. It felt, to many passengers, like a mild shudder, like the ship had rolled over something in the road. Some people didn't even wake up. The damage looked minor from the inside, a few compartments taking on water. Nothing the ship wasn't designed to handle, except the ship had been designed to survive 4 flooded compartments. The iceberg had opened 5. But here's what nobody was asking yet. Not the passengers, not the officers, not even the captain. The Titanic had been sailing at nearly full speed through a known ice field at night, with no binoculars on the lookout deck, on the calmest sea in years. Someone had received the most precise ice warning of the entire voyage and buried it under a pile of passenger telegrams. 6 warnings in one day. And the ship didn't slow down. That's either extraordinary negligence or something else entirely. There was another ship out there that night, close enough to see the Titanic's lights, close enough to help. It did nothing. Let's go back to the radio room. 2 operators, 1 frequency, no system for separating emergencies from personal messages. An ice warning from a nearby ship arrived in the same queue as a first-class passenger's telegram to his banker. Same priority, same pile. On April 14th, that pile was enormous. The Titanic had suffered a technical outage the day before. 12 hours of backed-up messages. Operator Jack Phillips had been working through them for hours. He was exhausted, and the warnings kept coming in. 9 in the morning. The Coronia reports ice ahead. Message reaches the bridge. Noon. The Baltic reports large icebergs directly on the Titanic's course. Captain Smith receives it and hands it to J. Bruce Ismay, the director of White Star Line, traveling on board as a guest. Ismay puts it in his pocket. It stays there for hours. 1:42 p.m. The America reports 2 large icebergs. This message never reaches the bridge at all. 7:30 p.m. The Californian warns of 3 large bergs. Logged, acknowledged, forgotten. Then comes 9:40 p.m. This is the one that changes everything. The Mesaba's warning wasn't vague. It didn't say ice reported in the area. It gave coordinates, precise ones. A dense field of pack ice and bergs covering a specific stretch of ocean. The exact stretch the Titanic was sailing into at that moment. Phillips received it. He stamped it. set it under a stack of passenger telegrams, and never sent it to the bridge. 55 minutes later, Frederick Fleet picked up the phone. "Iceberg, right ahead." 11 miles away, something else was happening. The SS Californian had spent the afternoon pushing through heavy ice. By 10:20 p.m., her captain, Stanley Lord, made a decision. He stopped the ship. Engines off. Hold position until daylight. The Californian sat motionless in the darkness, 11 miles from where the Titanic would strike the iceberg 40 minutes later. Her radio operator, Cyril Evans, had been trying to reach the Titanic all evening. At 11 p.m., he tried one last time. Evans broke into the Titanic's frequency. Phillips cut him off instantly. "Shut up, shut up. I am busy." Those were his exact words. Evans switched off his radio. He went to bed at 11:30 p.m. 9 minutes later, the iceberg. The only ship within rescue distance had gone silent. At the time, it seemed like a routine exchange between two tired men. Later, it would be called one of the most consequential moments of the entire disaster. Shortly after midnight, the Californian's deck crew noticed something on the horizon. White rockets, fired at intervals. One, then another, then another. 8 in total. In maritime code, white rockets at night mean one thing: a ship in distress. The crew reported it to Captain Lord. He was resting in the chart room. Lord asked if they were company identification signals. Nobody knew. He did not order the radio turned back on. He watched the rockets and went back to rest. At the inquiry, Captain Lord claimed the ship he saw wasn't the Titanic. He claimed the rockets might have been private company signals. He claimed the distance was uncertain, but the inquiry established something he couldn't argue with. His officers had tracked that ship for over an hour, watched her lights shift position, watched 8 rockets climb into the sky, and then watched the lights disappear. Not sail away, disappear. The way a ship disappears when it sinks below the waterline. Lord was formally censured. Historians still debate whether he could have saved hundreds of lives. The Carpathia, the ship that actually rescued survivors, was 4 hours away when she received the distress signal. The Californian was 11 miles, 6 warnings in one day. The most critical one buried under passenger telegrams, a radio operator sent to bed, a captain watching distress rockets from his chart room. Every single failure pointed in the same direction, not toward the iceberg, toward the decisions being made by specific people. But here's what the inquiry never asked loudly enough. Among the passengers standing on that deck, watching half-empty lifeboats disappear into the dark, were some of the most powerful men of the 20th century. Men with enemies, men who stood in the way of something enormous, and at least one man who was supposed to be on that ship, but made a phone call the day before and never boarded. 3 men died on the Titanic that night. Between them, they controlled more wealth than most countries. And all 3 had one thing in common: beyond money. First class on the Titanic wasn't just luxury. It was a floating summit of American power. The dining room seated over 500 people. The menu ran to 11 courses. The wine list was longer than most restaurants' entire selections. And the guest list read like a directory of the most influential names in the United States. These weren't simply rich men on vacation. They were the kind of men whose decisions moved markets, whose opinions shaped legislation, whose presence in a room changed the outcome of meetings. And on the night of April 14th, several of them were about to die. Colonel John Jacob Astor IV was the wealthiest passenger on board. His net worth in 1912 was approximately $87 million. Adjusted for today, somewhere between $2 and $3 billion. He had just returned from an extended honeymoon in Egypt with his second wife, Madeline, who was 18 years old and 5 months pregnant. When the evacuation began, Astor helped his wife into Lifeboat 4. He asked an officer if he could accompany her, citing her condition. The officer said no. Women and children first. Astor stepped back from the lifeboat without argument. His body was recovered from the ocean 11 days later, still dressed in his evening clothes. Isidore Straus co-owned Macy's department store. He was 67 years old. When the lifeboats began loading, his wife Ida refused to leave him. She reportedly said, "Where you go, I go." Witnesses saw them sit down together on a pair of deck chairs as the ship listed around them. They were last seen holding hands. Neither survived. Their story became one of the most repeated accounts of that night. A love story inside a catastrophe. But Straus was more than a department store owner. He was a former United States congressman, a man with significant influence over American financial policy. Benjamin Guggenheim was heir to one of America's great mining fortunes. When it became clear the ship was sinking, Guggenheim did something that eyewitnesses never forgot. He went below deck, changed out of his life jacket, put on his finest evening suit and white tie. He returned to the deck and told a steward, "We are dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." His body was never recovered. 3 men, 3 enormous fortunes, 3 very different deaths. But here's the detail that historians keep returning to. Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim were not simply wealthy. All 3 were known opponents of a specific financial proposal that had been circulating in Washington since 1910. A proposal to create a central banking system for the United States. What would eventually become the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law in December 1913, 20 months after the Titanic sank. At the time, opposition to the bill had been significant. Several of America's most powerful financial figures had publicly argued against centralized banking, against surrendering control of the money supply to a small group of private institutions. By December 1913, the loudest of those voices were gone. We'll come back to this. In 1898, long before the world ever heard the name Titanic, an obscure merchant sailor and writer, Morgan Robertson, sat down and wrote a short novel. He called it Futility. This was not just fiction. It was a story about a massive ocean liner, the largest ever built. A marvel of engineering, a symbol of progress. They called it Unsinkable. The ship sets out across the North Atlantic. A cold April ocean, a dark night, calm waters, and one detail almost lost in the description. There are not enough lifeboats on board. The passengers aren't worried. The crew is confident. After all, this ship cannot sink. But it does. After striking an iceberg, the ship in the novel was named Titan. 14 years later, in 1912, in nearly the same waters, something happens that can no longer be called fiction. The Titanic. The similarities don't end with the name. The ships are nearly identical in size, both among the largest in the world, both traveling at high speed through iceberg waters. Both collide in April in the North Atlantic. And in both cases, there are far too few lifeboats for everyone on board. Even the nature of the damage and the way the disaster unfolds are disturbingly similar. This no longer feels like coincidence. Morgan Robertson died in 1915. He was asked many times the same question. How did he predict it? He never gave a clear answer. Only once did he say, "The story simply came to me." And that is the most unsettling part. Not what he wrote, but how he knew. Three of America's most powerful financial opponents of the Federal Reserve, dead in the North Atlantic. A novel predicting the disaster with surgical accuracy, written 14 years earlier, and a man who controlled the company that owned the Titanic, who had a private suite reserved on board, who canceled his trip at the last moment. That man's name was John Pierpont Morgan. And the deeper you look into his decision, the harder it becomes to call it a coincidence. His suite was ready, his luggage was packed, his name was on the passenger list. J.P. Morgan never boarded. By 1912, John Pierpont Morgan wasn't just a banker. He was the financial architecture of an entire nation. He had personally bailed out the United States government twice. He had built U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. He controlled railroads, shipping lines, insurance companies. He owned White Star Line, the company that built the Titanic. Morgan had reserved Suite B52 for the maiden voyage months in advance. Private promenade deck, imported French furniture, personal bath. On April 10th, the day of departure, he didn't show up. His office cited business commitments, a last-minute conflict, nothing unusual. Within days of the sinking, reporters found him at a spa resort in Aix-les-Bains, France. Healthy, relaxed, unbothered. Not a man who had narrowly escaped a catastrophe. A man who had simply not been there. Here's what's worth sitting with. Morgan had booked that voyage months in advance. He had a custom suite. He was traveling with personal antiques he'd planned to bring aboard. What kind of last-minute business commitment makes a man leave all of that behind? Morgan wasn't alone. At least 50 wealthy passengers canceled in the days before departure. Henry Clay Frick, one of America's most powerful industrialists, gone. Alfred Vanderbilt, heir to the greatest railroad fortune in history, gone. Each had their own explanation. None of them boarded. None of them drowned. Ask yourself, what are the odds? The Titanic had a sister, the RMS Olympic, nearly identical, built at the same shipyard, launched months apart. In September 1911, the Olympic collided with a Royal Navy vessel, HMS Hawke. Serious damage, expensive repairs. White Star Line filed an insurance claim. It was denied. The ruling placed fault on the Olympic. No payout. The repair costs had to be absorbed entirely by the company. For a shipping line already under financial pressure, it was a crisis. Here is the question some researchers started asking. What if the ships were swapped? The Olympic and Titanic were near identical from the outside. Same hull, same layout. The interior differences, minor fittings, small design changes, were invisible at a distance. What if the damaged Olympic was quietly refitted to resemble her sister? Sent on a maiden voyage under the Titanic's name. Sunk to collect the insurance policy that the Olympic had already been denied. The Titanic was insured for £5 million, precisely her declared value. Mainstream historians reject the theory, but certain details have never been cleanly explained. Workers at Harland and Wolff reported visible construction inconsistencies between the two ships during the final weeks before departure. Inconsistencies that were quietly corrected. Nobody officially documented why. Here is a fact that requires no theory. The Titanic carried enough lifeboats for 1,178 people. She was carrying 2,224. The original design specifications called for more boats. Someone reduced that number before the voyage. Nobody was ever identified. Nobody was ever charged. And it gets worse. Even the lifeboats that existed didn't leave full. Lifeboat 1 had capacity for 40 people. It left with 12. Lifeboat 7, the first to depart, carried 28 in a boat rated for 65. If every lifeboat had left at full capacity, 500 more people would have survived. 500. Why were they half empty? Who gave the order to launch before they were full? The inquiry never produced a clear answer. Now hold all of it together. Astor, Guggenheim, Straus, three of the most prominent opponents of the Federal Reserve Act. Dead. Morgan, the man most closely associated with creating a central bank, alive. In France, rested. The Federal Reserve Act passed in December 1913, pushed through Congress on December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, when half the legislature had already gone home. It passed with almost no opposition. The loudest opponents were gone. There is no document connecting Morgan to what happened that night. No order, no confession, no paper trail. What exists is a pattern. Full speed through a known ice field. Warnings buried. A rescue ship that stayed silent. Lifeboats that left half empty. 3 powerful men dead. 1 powerful man who didn't board. And a financial system built in the wreckage, with its most dangerous opponents no longer alive to fight it. Here's the question I want you to sit with. In the entire history of the 20th century, which single event created the clearest path to centralized financial control of the United States? Think about that. Because we're not done yet. The ship was found in 1985, 2 miles below the surface, broken in half. Some questions went down with it. Others never needed to. In the weeks after the sinking, 2 official inquiries were launched. One in the United States, one in Britain. Both asked the same core question. How did this happen? Both reached roughly the same answer. Negligence, poor judgment, a tragic combination of circumstances that nobody could have fully anticipated. Captain Smith was blamed, posthumously. He went down with the ship. Second Officer Lightoller, the most senior surviving officer, gave testimony that investigators found evasive, selective, carefully worded. He was never charged. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line director who had kept the Baltic's ice warning in his pocket for hours, escaped on Lifeboat C. He resigned from White Star Line shortly after. He was never charged either. Here is a fact that doesn't appear in most accounts of that night. A lifeboat drill had been scheduled for April 14th, the morning of the collision. It was canceled. No official reason was ever recorded. The crew had never practiced a full evacuation. Officers had never coordinated a complete lifeboat loading sequence with the actual davits and ropes on this specific ship. When the evacuation began, in the dark, on a listing deck, with panicking passengers, nobody had rehearsed what to do. The half-empty lifeboats weren't just the result of poor decisions in the moment. They were the result of a drill that never happened. Ask yourself, who canceled it? And why was that decision never investigated? We established in Part 2 that the Californian was 11 miles away. Here's what we didn't mention. The Carpathia, the ship that actually rescued survivors, was 58 miles away when she received the distress signal. She arrived at 4:10 a.m. By then, the Titanic had been underwater for nearly 2 hours. The Carpathia's captain, Arthur Rostron, pushed his ship beyond her rated speed to reach the survivors. He prepared his medical staff. He organized blankets, food, hot drinks. He did everything right, and he was 58 miles away. The Californian was 11. That gap, 47 miles, represents an unknowable number of lives. Captain Lord of the Californian lived until 1962. He spent 50 years insisting he had done nothing wrong. In 1898, Morgan Robertson wrote a novel about a ship called Titan, largest ever built, described as unsinkable, sinking in April in the North Atlantic. too few lifeboats. We mentioned this in part 1. Here's what we didn't tell you then. The novel's full title was Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. Futility. Robertson chose that word deliberately. The book wasn't really about a shipwreck. It was about human arrogance, about the certainty that technology had conquered nature, about the belief that something built by men could be beyond failure. The word futility means the quality of having no useful result. No matter what you do, no matter how much you know, no matter how many warnings arrive. Some things happen anyway, or they are made to happen. 1,517 people died on April 15, 1912. Not statistics. People. A pregnant woman whose husband stepped back from the lifeboat without argument. An elderly couple who chose to die together rather than be separated. Engineers who stayed below deck, keeping the lights on so others could find the boats. Musicians who kept playing. The official history is clean. A ship traveled too fast. An iceberg appeared. The ship wasn't built to survive it. But the facts surrounding that night, the warnings, the canceled drill, the half-empty lifeboats, the silent radio, the man who didn't board, the financial legislation that followed, they form a picture that the official history doesn't quite cover. Not a conspiracy, not necessarily, but not simply an accident either. Before the closing, I want to ask you something. Go back to part 2. The moment Jack Phillips receives the Mesaba warning, he's exhausted. The queue of passenger messages is enormous. The warning sits in his hands for 30 seconds before he sets it down. Pause the video. Think about that moment. Then come down to the comments and tell me, what would you have done differently? Not as a hero, not in hindsight, as a tired man doing his job at 9:40 p.m. with no reason yet to believe this night would be any different from the last 3. I want to know what you think. The wreck was discovered in September 1985 by a team led by Robert Ballard. It sat in 2 pieces, 3,800 meters below the surface. The grand staircase, gone. Collapsed inward as the ship imploded on the way down. The safe in Morgan's reserved suite, still there. Still locked. Nobody has opened it. Maybe there's nothing inside. Maybe that's exactly the point. The Titanic didn't just sink. She took her secrets with her. And the questions she left behind have never fully come back up.